Hello and welcome to the Archaeology Society of Connecticut and Friends of the Office of State Archaeology's joint fall lecture series. Be sure to tune in to the rest of our series with lectures by Dr. Anthony Martin on November 10th and Dr. Sarah Sportman on November 17th. But tonight we are pleased to have with us Dr. Gabriel Reineck, who is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of New Brunswick. Gabe specializes in the archaeological record of the far Northeast with a particular focus on coastal sites from the terminal archaic to protohistoric periods. Dr. Reineck holds a PhD from the University of Connecticut, and his research has been published in numerous local, regional, and national academic journals. He recently published a comprehensive book on the archaeology of the far Northeast with co-author Matt Betts. Tonight, he will be speaking about coastal archaeology in Downeast Maine. As with our previous lecture series, please ask your questions through the chat feature, I think that's what it's called, or the Q&A feature. Either one of those will work. If you would like to ask a question in person, you can digitally raise your hand, and then I can activate your microphone and or camera. But please also remember that you are being recorded if you are going to ask a question via camera or microphone. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Reineck, and I will remove my video from this and take it away, Gabe.
Thanks very much, Dave. It's good to be back in Connecticut virtually. So like Dave said, I'm going to just talk about some archaeological work I've been doing in Downeast coastal Maine. And this is really just going to be sort of a review of some recent stuff, some of which, some names of people that are involved in it will be familiar. So I'm taking some credit for other people's work here. So the region, it's become customary to start off with a territorial acknowledgement. But one of the ways that I've been trying to think about this lately and sort of conceptualize this is related to the work that I'm going to talk about today, which involves questions of settlement and subsistence. And so the region that I'm talking about here is the Maritime Peninsula, which is Maine, most of Maine, the Maritime provinces, and the Gaspé region of Quebec. And it almost seems a little bit trite to just say that this is the unsurrendered and unceded territory of the Wabanaki without kind of pondering what that might mean. And I think one of the things that we might infer from this is when we think about what it means for a place to be home, we have from Thoreau in the Maine Woods talking about basically delivering, he's been bombing around Maine with this Penobscot guide, Joe Paulus, who he greatly admired, and he's going to drop him off basically near the Kineo Rhyolite source. And he says, are you glad to be home? And Paulus says to him that it makes no difference to me where I am. And Thoreau reads into this that some of this has to do with a conception of a homeland that involves moving through space. And that rather than being a specific spot, it's really this whole region. And so as I make this presentation and start to think about the use of space across this area, that's something maybe to keep in mind. More narrowly, the region I'm going to talk about today is the Quoddy Region, which sits on the Maine-New Brunswick border and is defined by Passamaquoddy Bay. It's a biogeographically defined area. And one of the key components of life in this area was that there's dramatic coastal upwelling due to the substantial tides. So just a little further up the coast, the Bay of Fundy, some of the largest tides in the world, UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so they're pretty substantial here in the Quoddy region. This drives a huge amount of biological productivity in the area and attracted people to live in this place. We know we've got direct evidence on the coast for occupation from maybe 3,800 years ago through to the present, but in the adjacent areas in Charlotte County, New Brunswick, and Washington County, Maine, occupations going back to about 12,800 years ago with the Paleo-Indian period. This region has seen substantial archaeological interest over the last 223 years. And the founding of archaeology in New Brunswick came after the Revolutionary War, where it turned out the Treaty of Paris, nicely written down, but a little bit vague in some details due to some crummy maps. And one of the issues was that clearly the St. Croix River, where Champlain had settled in his ill-fated early 17th century overwintering, where half of his men had gotten scurvy and died, They said, people have said, well, that's the St. Croix River that defines the boundary, but the maps, it could have been the Magadavich River, it could have been the Scudic River, could have been even various rivers feeding into Cobscook Bay. And so a fellow named Robert Pagan and a surveyor named Thomas Wright set out and said, well, we better find this settlement. So they went out and found Champlain settlement, and probably much to Pagan's relief, who was a loyalist and had gone to St. Andrews, New Brunswick, they found it, and it turned out to be what we now know as the St. Croix River. So that's sort of your historical orientation here, but this is some of the oldest archaeology going on. Give you kind of a rough history of work after that. A fellow named George Frederick Matthew, who was the customs inspector at St. John Harbor here in New Brunswick, wrote some papers about shell-bearing sites, so shell midden or shell heap sites, also in the St. Andrews region. And these are some reports, one in particular, the Stone Age village at Boquebec, that Bruce Trigger described as one of the best accounts of a coastal archaeological site before the 1900s. But following that, there's a period that Art Spies and others have termed the doldrums, where there was really very little work. In this talk tonight, one of the things I'm going to do is flesh out some of the work that was going on during this doldrums period that lasted from the Natural Historical Society work at the end of the 1800s, really into the 1960s. And so there was, in fact, work going on, just much of it wasn't published, due in large part to, it being some uncompleted but very good work that didn't actually become a dissertation, but more on that shortly. In the late 1960s, here is in the United States, archaeology became much more professional. And folks, especially David Sanger, shown here, and Chris Turnbull, the first provincial archaeologist in New Brunswick, initiated programs of coastal research, recognizing that these coastal archaeological sites weren't going to be around forever. Here is in Connecticut, we have fewer hurricanes, but we've got rising sea levels, and the storms are worse than they used to be. And we've got more severe freeze-thaw cycles causing sites to shear off into various bays. And this was recognized even then. And so a lot of the work that's happened in this area, we owe to that. More recently, David Black, my predecessor here at UNB, undertook substantial survey in Passamaquoddy Bay, looking at, in particular, at the islands. And then Art Spies with the Maine Historic Preservation Commission did substantial survey work and supervised substantial survey work out of his office, relocating sites and identifying some new ones. And then from about 2013 to now, along with colleagues, I've been involved with what we've called the Northeastern Archaeological Survey, in homage to some of this work from the 40s and the 50s that I'll tell you about. And so Ted Stoddard and Bob Dyson, the recently late Bob Dyson, who became famous for some work elsewhere, we're really looking around for dissertation material for Ted Stoddard's Harvard dissertation. He's still alive, and colleagues and I are very fortunate to be interacting with him. But this work, unfortunately, never materialized in the dissertation that he'd meant it to be. And in fact, he went on to a career in the government and in the military. And he was based out of the Robert S. Peabody Museum in Andover, which some of you may be familiar with, in part because it houses the the Bull Brook site, the basis of the DeBert project, some of the formative Paleo-Indian studies, and also because it's fairly local to where all of you are in Connecticut. And so in an experience that's very reminiscent still of if you're going from the South into Washington County, Ted and Bob Dyson would take Bessie, this vehicle shown here at the left, a sort of pickup truck that had been outfitted out of the Robert S. Peabody Museum. And they would marvel at the new Maine Turnpike. They would stop at LL Bean in Freeport, and then they would bitch about Route 1 going from Bangor into Washington County, which was a terrible road then and is still a pretty crummy road. And you'll see at the right here, they would encounter many of the sorts of graduate student problems with which some of us are familiar with. Writing to Doug Byers that it's fairly urgent that $50 be wired to Maine. I think I sent Kevin McBride, not a telegram like this, but certainly a few text messages like this during my field work. And one of the things, though, that I'd like to stress about this work is that despite being incomplete or never fully or never even really substantially published, is that part of the reason for that was that it was remarkably modern work. At various points, Stoddard ponders in his correspondence that if they'd had a computer and that he's beginning to get interested in computers, which are still, of course, a new technology, they might really be able to sort out some of this seriation business, some of this sort of nuts and bolts culture history stuff. And my colleague Arthur Anderson, standing in the middle here, is holding one of their analog attempts to do so, in which they, on this gigantic roll of paper, are actually coming pretty close to what we still know about the region and the way that the various time periods and phases and so forth, in the kind of classic culture history terminology, come together. Stuff that really wouldn't be sorted out into the present, and and stuff that also we continue to grapple with, especially down east, where we've had a bit less research than elsewhere in Maine. Today, as in Stoddard and Dyson's fieldwork time, the biggest factor that's affecting archaeological sites along the coast of this part of Maine is sea level rise. And shown here at the left is a diagram from Kelly and colleagues who sort of figured out Maine's sea level curve. And the point here is really just that there's a kind of process that goes on here where people live close to the coast, and we've got these rising sea levels. So as people are living near the coast, they're, even before European contact, are shifting somewhat inland, so because sea level is rising a little bit, right? And so as a result, the oldest components of sites are the first ones to be eroded away. So this means that the kinds of work that Ted and Bob Dyson were doing that now sits in the collections at the Robert S. Peabody Museum, this is the kind of stuff that we won't find in intact archaeological deposits. So in particular, it's material from the transitional Archaic period, or even from the early Woodland and increasingly the middle Woodland period. Another daunting statistic of this is that of the archaeological sites that were identified between about 1950 and about 2000, colleagues and I have attempted to relocate many of them, ones that especially are not on private property or that we have access to that doesn't involve crossing private property, or that we have access to via a friendly landowner. Over 60% of these we haven't been able to relocate at all. So no traces of shell. The sites are just gone. You can see here in the picture at the right, what one of these actually fairly in good condition archaeological sites, because you can see field school students excavating some of the remnant portions of this site, the Versing Falls site, looks like. You'll see shell spilling out. You see that thin erosional face is really, is a stark reminder to those of us doing coastal research. With all of these kind of factors in mind, the goals of the Northeastern Archaeological Survey as it stands now, which we named after the work that Stoddard and Dyson were doing, the primary goal here is to put coastal hunter-gatherer cultural transitions in historical and environmental context. So we're looking in particular at trying to nuance somewhat the ways in which culture changed along the coast over really the last 3,500 years or something like that. If we look at collections, closer to the last 2,200 years if we're looking at intact archaeological deposits. This work hopefully forms a comparative with work colleagues are doing on the South Shore of Nova Scotia and that I've been involved with on the South Shore of Nova Scotia for over a decade now, and in Southern Maine with some recent work at sites in Biddeford near the University of New England. One of the steps that we're engaged in this work has been to try to build site inventory. So that work I just alluded to of actually trying to find the sites that still exist on the coast and get a sense of what sort of time they encode. Of course, we've got tremendous benefit now due to the relative affordability of radiocarbon dates, running radiocarbon dates on terrestrial mammal bone with pretty good success, and also having a better understanding of the stratigraphy of shell-bearing sites. And the stratigraphy of shell-bearing sites, of course, is a debate that also played out in southern New England. So it's kind of a nice connection there to Connecticut. We're also taking an approach here that culture history isn't really solved, that it makes some sense to try to figure out historical context for the things people do, right? So trying to figure out with some more nuance what kind of things people are up to and how that may inform the things they get up to later in time, right? How are they reusing sites? How are they shifting the location very slightly of where they're building their wigwams and sites? And then finally, this is a training program Dave mentioned I teach here at UNB. We've got numerous graduate student projects, which I'll mention here. We run a field school in Downeast Maine when COVID and a relatively flexible border permits it. And then finally, we've been fortunate to be involved in some citizen science initiatives, in particular through the Maine Midden-Minders program headed by Ellis Kelly out of the University of Maine. So I've mentioned that the focus here is on shell heap sites, and this will be no mystery to those of you in New England. Although unlike the ones in New England, ours are heavily dominated by soft shell clam, Maya arenaria. Here, as in southern New England, one of the real benefits of working in sites that have shell is that as the shell breaks down or releases calcium carbonate into the soil, generating really exceptional preservation conditions in our normally extremely acidic soils. The result is a repository of information, both cultural and ecological, that's really unrivaled in the Northeast. We get improved plant preservation, although still not great, and this is an underexplored area of research in this project. We get good bone preservation in shell heaps. We get more visible cultural features and artifacts of kinds that might not otherwise preserve do so, particularly those made out of bone. Within this, there are also substantial cultural information about what sort of things people eat. And increasingly, there's a sort of recognition that shell heaps may be a highly visible marker of where people lived and where they return to over and over again. One of the points, just returning very briefly to how we can think about economy, is that work by Art Spies and by other people has recently emphasized that we've tended to think of shellfish as really a kind of last resort food. They're actually pretty nutritious and they're available more or less year round, although our pattern for harvest definitely emphasizes cold weather harvest of these species. And you'll see at the top right here, in contrast to the kinds of patterns we see in Nova Scotia or in, say, Penobscot Bay, further south of this work, or certainly in southern Maine, a fairly diverse shell midden. We get soft shell clam, we get urchin, and in fact, we even get enough barnacle that has led us to argue in a recent paper that people are consuming fairly large acorn barnacles. In general, shell middens can also preserve important information that's useful to people doing paleoecology. Some middens contain species such as great auks or sea mink, and there's also opportunity within this for paleo-environmental reconstruction, also an area of research we hope to continue to explore. I mentioned that one of our interests here is settlement subsistence, and so I'm taking this opportunity to kind of meditate on a sort of thought that's been kind of kicking around in my head, curious what people think about it. But as Dave mentioned, I spent grad school in Connecticut in Kevin McBride's lab, And, you know, one of the themes, right, the kind of Kevin McBride themes is basically, you know, did maize matter, right? And so, you know, that work by Dewar McBride, I mean, probably, you know, I think Chilton said, you know, we wouldn't say no one would believe this now, right? But the, you know, how much did maize matter? Kind of a provocative thing, right? Because we sort of start to see the question, where are these villages anyway, you know? And to what degree is this maybe a dispersed village model, right? To what degree are these really mobile foragers treating maize as among a bunch of other, you know, important resources, but not really as kind of a full-blown horticultural resource like we'd imagine. I'm fully aware I may have just sort of like prodded a wasp nest with a Southern New England audience here, but that's all right. And so, but one of the things I'd like to kind of posit here is that if you take that stance, even if you take the kind of soft stance that these are dispersed villages in Southern New England, they're, you know, maize is maybe not, you know, super important. They're mobile foragers. We've got some evidence in the Maritime Peninsula that would suggest, you know, we don't have maize, but a lot of the other social stuff that seems to be going on in the woodland is pretty similar. We've got ceramics, of course, and sometimes it's even called the ceramic period up here. We've got burial elaboration. That's supposed to be a big thing in the kind of horticultural woodland period. We've got the Augustine Mound site, for instance, here in New Brunswick, Skora, Nova Scotia, and other sites too. And we don't have use of maize, but we've got intensification of other species. This is a table from Jesse Webb's, I think, brilliant master's thesis, where he highlighted just the degree to which at certain task-specific sites, people are exploiting really enormous amounts of particular fish species. Here he's talking in particular about Microgratis tomcod. You'll see that big NISP there, 480. And that's from, you know, a fairly minuscule portion of the site. You know, extrapolate over this, and he basically argued that this was a fish trap that people are seasonally exploiting for enormous numbers of tomcod. You know, does that mean storage? I'll return to that notion later. But if you could kind of file this away in your mind, that this is kind of a place I'm coming at this question from, or this kind of bigger regional question, that should we look south and look for some of these similarities and try to grapple with some of those problems all you folks in Southern New England are dealing with. So for the rest of the talk, what I'll do is I'll take the sites in approximate order and focusing just on ones we've worked on. And then after that, I'll give you a kind of pie in the sky synthesis of what I think is going on. The first I'm going to talk to dates to the middle woodland period, something like 2200 BP up here, into the late woodland period, you know, going into something like 1000 BP. I'll show you the radiocarbon dates in a minute. And it's interesting because it sits on the reversing falls, which you can see here. Basically, there's a constricture in Cobscook Bay. Whole bunch of water is pumped through that tight area, and it goes over a bedrock shelf. That bedrock shelf creates the illusion that the falls is reversing, and the practicality that the falls is dangerous as hell if you try to go through it during that period. And that's a real problem potentially, because if you want to get marine access from this part of Cobscook Bay into either Denny's Bay or Whiting Bay, this is the area you would go through unless you're going to cut across and around an island called Falls Island. It's probably only safe to canoe into at slack tides when the falls calms down. You know, to give you some idea about this, it's a real marine hazard. A while ago, they closed down part of the urchin fishery in the area, and there was kind of a tragic accident where some folks in a dragger got into this basically fishing area they didn't know, caught their gear and flipped it. And the only thing they ever found from the fellows on board was one of the guys' billfolds washed up in Eastport. So it's really tumultuous, dangerous area. The question here, though, I mean, you can get around Falls Island, you know, so what's really going on here? But at the moment, I still am inclined to think that the benefit here, you can see Maine 80.5 on this, image. I think if I click on this, I get a laser pointer. There we go. So if you want to do this, you better be awfully careful if the falls is going. You bomb around Falls Island. And one of the things we're going to have a graduate student do, hopefully next year, is look in some depth at the collection here from the site on Falls Island and get a sense, are these contemporaneous, But if you can control these 2 points, you really control the whole area. So, are these social concerns in the Middle Woodland? The dates on this that we have here, just ignore this guy over here at the left, this early woodland date. A bunch of these dates are on incrustations from pottery. We almost certainly screwed this one up based on the isotopes and accidentally zapped something with some marine carbon in it and got an old date with like a, old marine carbon date. But we see instead pretty steady occupation from, somewhere between 1500 and 2000 up to like 1,000 years ago. In the intertidal, eroded out, we found some material that looks like it's probably older. Similarly, in the collection from work at this site by Stoddard and colleagues at the Robert S. Peabody Museum, we found some material that looks like it's probably transitional archaic or maybe even a little earlier. This site, however, isn't just the kind of place where people seem to be, stopping and waiting to canoe through once the falls are at slack tide. We've got evidence here for dwelling features. This black saucer-shaped stain here is really a kind of classic dwelling surface. It's got a little bit of gravel added to it, and this black greasy lens, this dated in the Middle Woodland, is what Middle Woodland dwelling features look like all over the region. The reason we've only excavated this much of it is that this site's pretty extensively looted, and there were looting pits on either corner of it. And there are also folks at this site in the Middle Woodland that are eating a lot of soft-shell clam for sure, but they're eating a lot of other economic species too, which surprised us. They're eating the acorn barnacle, they're eating green urchin, they're eating various species of mussel, and they seem to be eating the northern whelk. And this is in contrast to the usual impression that Downeast middens are overwhelmingly soft-shell clam. I mean, this is still, I guess I should say, this is still overwhelmingly soft-shell clam, but there's a lot of other food materials in here too. So kind of shaking up a little bit what we think about the way people are eating in the Middle Woodland. Jesse Webb's doing the faunal analysis here. And we've done, over 1,000 pieces of the bone, which is most of the assemblage. I should say it's like random-ish, what we've done so far. So I think it probably presents a pretty good picture of the foodways there in terms of the non-shell species. I think we've all sort of done this, right? It's random-ish in the sense that it's the ones that we've seen on the table that look the easiest to identify. So there's some stuff we're probably not going to have much luck identifying still out there. About 30% fish, mostly cod and sculpin. Mammal constitutes almost 70%. Birds constitute a fairly minuscule amount of the zooarchaeological assemblage. But this note here, unidentified class, is going to increase undoubtedly with the material we have left to identify. The sculpin may suggest that this occupation is spring to fall dominated. It may, it's a pretty mixed seasonal indicator. Are they using it at various points? We don't know, but that seems to be, if we were to guess how it dominates. There's over 1,700 pieces of flake stone. Most of this is debitage. We've got 28 bifaces, some unifaces, some cores, some bipole reduction, calling, wedges, but whatever you want, right? PEs, wedges. These are, the vast majority of these are made on local materials. I'll talk more about this in the next slide. A huge amount of the lithics collection was recovered from the intertidal zone, accentuating just how much erosion we're seeing at this site. So this is not really systematic collection. This is collection at lunchtime by field school students, which we've got it gridded out in the sense that they can report where they find the stuff in the field school, and we bag it to the zone. We've got these 5-meter zones across the intertidal, but the site's getting pretty wrecked. Al Hansinger's master's thesis, which he brilliantly defended on Wednesday. It's part of the reason my voice is slipping. Involved, his approach was to thin section some of this material from the intertidal and use those thin sections for more nuanced petrographic analysis, and also for some work using XRD. He emphasized the degree to which material from this site was local, includes mudstones, jaspers, various kinds of predominantly local sedimentary material. There's also some material, with, one flake from Rama Bay, and I really should have shown that picture, right? That's sort of cruel to mention a Rama flake and then not put it up. I'll take that as a kind of, I'm appropriately chagrined. And some material from Scott's Bay over in Nova Scotia. And then even using this approach, some materials undetermined, right? I don't need to kind of tell you all that identifying Northeast lithic materials is difficult. Trevor Lamb, graduate student at BU, analyzed our ceramic artifacts, over 2,000 sherds from the site, over 20 vessel lots. Overwhelmingly, these are Middle Woodland ceramic period 2 or 3. It's beginning of the Middle Woodland. Dentate motifs, some of which are shown here. And then some of that later material corresponding actually to those later radiocarbon dates I showed you earlier, with cordage impressions, adding to the theory that this site is residential and not exclusively a kind of place where you hang out and wait for the tides to turn. Are some materials he identified as probable manufacturing scraps. We'd like to do more isotope analysis of this, but his work so far has suggested that they're cooking both aquatic and terrestrial food in these, and in many of them they appear to be cooking both, that they're sort of stews. I alluded to the screwed up radiocarbon date where we nailed some marine material. Pivoting to another site, also on Cobscook Bay, is the SIP-1 site. This is a site that also is almost certainly from the Middle Woodland in part, and from the Late Woodland in part, based on our limited material from it so far, and from examining Ted Stoddard's collection. So you see here at the top right, some dentate forms of ceramic, and at the bottom, recovered from an eroding context, one of these small, the bottom of a small corner-notched projectile point. We excavated a trench in this site to try to get a sense of the stratigraphy. Not out of character for a Middle Woodland site. A lot of dentate ceramics, not much lithic material so far. Here's some of the material from the Robert S. Peabody collection from this. Like I mentioned, there are lithics shown there at left. SB stands for SIP Bay in this case. Some nice dentate materials. And then really intriguingly over here, some incised pebbles. These incised pebbles have previously been reported from Holt's Point. That's where they were. Those are the ones that have been published. But these are sort of portable art, kind of with some etching here, some interesting symbols on them. Okay, so talked about Middle Woodland to Late Woodland sites, 2 of these, right? So Reversing Falls and SIP-1. Now I'm taking you on the St. Croix River, not far, but a little bit, north of this place, towards the bustling metropolis of Downeast, Maine, to the Devil's Head site, which is where we have a late to contact period transition site that some folks on this call are familiar with. And I've sort of schematic what happened here, I think, on this image to the right. Radiocarbon dates are diagrammed at the bottom from each area. And so, I should mention, actually, this is like almost within, if it wasn't for the bend in the St. Croix River, it would be within, eye shot of bad news for Champlain at St. Croix Island. Well, not for him personally, but for, half of his employees. And what we've got here is and I'm going to say that this is what we've got based on the fauna, because on the next slide, I'm going to talk actually a little bit about some of Dave Leslie's work on this. we've got what appeared a cold season fauna in the late woodland, okay? Then in the protohistoric period, we don't have much protohistoric artifacts. We've got protohistoric dates, which suggest that something's going on here around the time of European contact that isn't really just dominated by getting European stuff, okay? So there's this settlement shift where it appeared to shift to a kind of warm season protohistoric occupation in slightly different locations on the river. This is just based on Jesse Webb's work here, where in area A, we've got some hair, we've got spirally fractured cervid longbone. Up in B and C, we've got, gatted and short-nosed sturgeon and Atlantic sturgeon. These are the funny-looking scoots, these kinds of parts of sturgeon. But when Jesse did this, one of the things he noted was that fish, like we were getting in B and C, are actually pretty easy to store. You can smoke them, you can dry them. And when Dave Leslie, through the generous support of a Douglas Jordan testing fund, so thank you, FOSA, found that Jesse's kind of take that area A could be spring or fall, that checked out. But over in area B, maybe Jesse's point that fish could be smoked or dried and stored might be really important, because we got basically a different kind of temperature signal using isotopes. So what this does is the oxygen isotopes proxy water temperature, and it seemed like this is also a winter occupation. Dave, takes a little bit of the terminal growth ring off the Maya Arenaria softshell clam, and then a miracle occurs that involves a lot of technology. And what it seems that's going on is people are smoking and drying fish to store in the late woodland. This is sort of a big deal, right? Because if you want to think about this in Binfordian terms, foragers aren't really supposed to do that, right? This is a delayed return strategy. This is something collectors do. And it suggests that there's some kind of a socioeconomic shift going on at this period. It's possible that the shellfish could also be stored, but we think it's pretty unlikely that this would happen in the shell, right? And there's a lot of shell there. So turning to kind of winding this down a little bit here, SIP2, which is a site that we've done very little work at, is an interesting protohistoric site. So I just said, I think maybe, as we get into these later periods, by the late woodland, by the protohistoric period, we're seeing some task specificity. We're seeing socioeconomic shifts. Are we seeing, not just residential mobility? We're seeing logistical mobility to various places. Well, on a site with a lot of shell and no artifacts, or very few artifacts, would suggest perhaps such a site dating to the protohistoric period here, roughly equivalent to those later periods at Devil's Head. In the 2018 testing, we found 29 flakes, but all out of one test pit, even though we dug 4, 1 core, and under 2 grams of bone. The Robert S. Peabody collection from this site numbers 1 artifact. It's a groundstone pecked adze. And so we think we're interested in exploring this some more, but to what degree does this perhaps represent a specialized processing site? And again, this would suggest a kind of change in settlement and subsistence in the protohistoric period, in the absence of kind of obvious European interaction, right? We're not pulling very many European artifacts out of this. We got a metal thing and a trade bead from over at Devil's Head in the protohistoric component, nothing anywhere else. So this is just a diagram of the radiocarbon dates I've talked about before as a way to kind of organize some of what I'm sort of summarizing here. So reversing falls shown here in these dates at the bottom. We see this middle and late woodland, seemingly residential site, although, different kinds of, it's on the reversing falls. What do we make of that? Probably a spring to fall dominated residence characterized by diverse and immediate return foraging, and also by shellfish consumption. We see then at the next area, having a little computer trouble here, a shift towards spring or fall residential mobility. I'm trying to get my pointer going here. And then shifting into the protohistoric, we see a kind of dominance of some of these task-specific sites. So at the bottom, if we were kind of peg this, as something, we'd say, well, this is, increased logistical mobility characterized by task-specific sites and more delayed return strategies. This is not unlike what we are seeing elsewhere in southern New England, even though in this area we don't have maize. So, the text version of this is really that what do we make of all this, alongside the intensification of some food sources elsewhere in the Quoddy region? What are the social implications of all this? And how do we think about this in terms of southern New England? And one of the things I think that I'd like to start considering is the possibility that we're looking at similarities really to some of the kinds of things people have talked about in terms of dispersed village models in southern New England. So moving forward, that's kind of the angle we're hoping to take in this work. And a whole whack of people to thank, including, though, all of you for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it, and thanks for inviting me.
Okay, thanks, Gabe. Let's see. So if anybody has questions, please ask them in the Q&A or chat feature. Let's see. So I had a couple. I'll start off while people are getting their keyboards warmed up. I think that this idea of fish intensification is really interesting, right? Particularly because it's got such a depth with other areas of the country or other areas with hunter-gatherers, right? And I wonder what similarities you've maybe thought about drawing from or considered from the work that's been done on Block Island, right? Where there is some maize there, but not a lot, right? It seems like there's a lot of fish intensification there maybe as well. Some of that is mostly based on Tedescov's thesis, but I don't know what your thoughts are on, if you think of Southern New England focus, where you look at what's happening on Block Island, I guess, compared to what you've got in Downeast Maine.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy. I think that's the sort of direction to look. So one of the other things that I wonder about too is that I don't think have done enough archaeobotanical work up here. So one of the things that appears to occur in the protohistoric period up here, at least at one site, is pretty substantial use of Apios americana, which is like a tuberous groundnut, right? So you can get these, and it responds really well. It's like Jerusalem artichokes. It responds really well to going out and kind of chopping it up and sort of gardening it. Yep. Like, to what degree, are people engaging in strategies that kind of dip in and out of using these plant resources to get some of their calories, and to what degree can we have varied, mobile farmer or mobile gardener models? I think one of the things that maybe we have in the Northeast is just that we've thought about hunter-gatherer complexity should look like, plank houses in British Columbia, right? We're getting away from that now. But I think that one of the contributions of the Northeast is to tease out those kinds of patterns. And I think fish in particular make a lot of sense to intensify because they are pretty easy to store, right?
Yeah.
What do you think?
I guess I also wonder, sorry?
Yeah, Doug, I'm curious what you think.
No, I was wondering, oh, yeah, so definitely. I think that it makes a lot of sense. I was wondering also, do you have any, you've got such good feature preservation there with your shell middens. Do you have things that look like hearths with posts around them that are close? Possible like fish smoking, racks, drying racks, anything like that preserves, or is that all, do you think, too ephemeral to find? I don't know.
So we have really wretched post mold preservation. We've got under 10 post molds in the Maritime Peninsula. Sorry, I shouldn't say in the Maritime Peninsula. I guess north of Penobscot Bay. So no, we don't. We've got some what David Sanger called disarticulated hearths, which he thinks are for shellfish smoking. They're kind of amorphous rock things. So we've got some specialized, or we've got weird features that look like they're for some kind of specialized cooking or smoking or something.
I guess another thing, and I just thought of it, like FCR associated with fish. I mean, you could imagine taking cobbles, heating them, and then placing the fish on those as a way to like help smoke or dry them that way. I know you could do. I've seen some good luck with protein residues of fish, on some artifacts. It's expensive though, so there's that, right? I don't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
I don't know. Just a thought about possible the presence of FCR with maybe also fish remains too. Could mean something.
That's a good thought.
Yeah. So Naomi Ritterford wants to know, if they were preserving fish, is there any evidence for salt production or use to help with this process?
None that I'm aware of, no. I'm not really sure what it would look like. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts what that would look like.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that there's some evidence that people maybe are like with ocean, you might be able to get some salt out of the seawater, but I think that's a pretty convoluted process.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know.
Then in the separate Q&A feature, Bill Farley says, speaking on the archaeobotany, do you think there's any chance that maize is in the region, but in a way we can't detect with macrobotanical analyses? He's thinking about phytolith studies that are pushing back the presence of maize on sites throughout the Western Hemisphere. Has there been any luck with phytolith? I guess it wouldn't be starch grain, but phytolith analyses in the far Northeast that you know of?
No real attempts. It'd be pretty interesting to do. I mean, it would be interesting. I mean, that ties it back to Block Island. Am I right that there's, as Krista's doing, is Block Island where Krista's working on phytoliths there?
Yeah, she is.
Yeah, it'd be pretty interesting. I'd be curious what context to try it in. Like my impression from phytolith studies, and correct me if you're wrong. Hi, Bill, by the way. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but that would work better. Like it would be a difficult way to like just try to chase a phytolith, right? Like from very mild kind of maize use, where it'd be more like if people are really processing the hell out of some maize, you'd chase it down, I think.
I mean, I know that in soil coring studies in southern New England, where you expect to see, I mean, we know that there were maize fields here in the late Woodland period, and maybe a little bit earlier, based on some of this phytolith work. But you don't even see like a maize pollen record in some of these. So pollen is another good example. But you don't necessarily see it most of the time in a lot of the cores that preserve these records where it should be. So I think it's just very ephemeral, and your best bet is with residues on pottery and or in feature soils too. If you're taking a soil sample and processing it for phytolith and just looking at it. I think that what I think that most people find when they look at phytolith studies of hearths, though, is they find lots of dicot fossils, so wood, right? Which makes sense. So there's additional information from Naomi. Her question about salt production, she says ceramic vessels and pans, also settling tanks and charcoal, typical evidence of salt production.
Cool. Yeah, no, to the truth, this is the first time I've even thought about it. But that's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly have, excellent ceramic preservation. So
yeah,
but a wide variety of things that. So what's the what kind of isotope work are you guys doing with the ceramics for what was cooked in them?
Yeah, I worried you'd ask that.
Yeah.
So to Trevor Land, you scrape off the incrustations, and it's it must be nitrogen, I guess, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think carbon and nitrogen analyses,
yeah,
but
yeah, and,
so
and
so
then
that's what you do. Is it? It's a trophic analysis,
that's right,
basically.
yeah, and then you plot it on these charts where you've got the how
Right.
much marine, how much terrestrial, or marine versus terrestrial, and then along with that, you get some sense that basically they're cooking stews in a lot of these pots.
Right.
Not a huge
Diatom.
surprise. Yeah.
So let's see if there's other questions. I don't want to monopolize all the question and answer session. Okay, so Naomi says she did her PhD on this in France, inland salt production during the European Iron Age. And she's got her email here, so I can email that to you, Gabe.
Yeah, could you? I can't see the chat for some reason, but if you could, I'd appreciate that, Naomi. I'd be interested in that.
Yeah, I'll send it to you in a minute via email.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. So I had another question here. Hold on, I'm just trying to copy and paste this in so that I don't lose the email. Okay. Let's see. Sorry, I've lost. This is all like in a small screen. What were we just talking about though?
I made the mistake of fielding an isotopes question. I was just going to pass those all off to you.
Right. Oh, I know what my other question was. So you've been radiocarbon dating the crustaceans off of those pottery sherds.
Yeah.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
And so then one of those you think had a marine reservoir. Of course, John Hart has suggested that there's a reservoir in all of them, no matter what, because of the use of fresh water too. Have you dated charcoal from? I mean, I think that reservoir is very minimal compared to the marine one. But have you dated charcoal from the bone, like terrestrial mammal bone from the shell middens too?
Yeah, we've dated terrestrial mammal bone. About half of the reversing falls dates are on terrestrial mammal. I'm not sure that at this scale, what Hart's talking about makes much difference. I think that matters a lot more if you're worried about Iroquoian villages. I could be proven wrong.
Yeah, no, I don't think that the freshwater aquifer or reservoir effect is significant to what you're dealing with.
I just, again, I think that's a village onset sort of question. I mean, sure, I guess it's nice to do it, but it's also nice to directly date your ceramics. So.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was so if other people have questions, please ask them. But those ceramics at the reversing falls site are interesting just because the sites are so isolating, right? And they're difficult to get to. Do you think that they're bringing those ceramics in via canoe as they get to the site, or do you think they're possibly making them there if it's a longer encampment?
I think it's possible they're making them there. There's some small ceramics. I mean, so they're low heat fired, right? I mean, so the actual wouldn't be that hard. There's some small kind of wonky scraps that look like they're maybe related to manufacturing. So I think probably some of both. There's clay not there, but there's clay nearby that we know of. So I think probably a mix.
Yeah,
that's speculation, but.
Yeah, no, but I mean, further evidence maybe that it's a longer term strategic place to be, I guess, right?
Yeah, I think so. That's my hunch anyway.
Yeah.
And sorry, actually, I just wanted to return just the other thing about the dating on the incrustations is that at least in a coarse way, I know this is not how science is supposed to work, but the dentate ceramics give middle woodland dates, right? And the cord wrap stiff stuff gives late dates. So, is there a wiggle? Maybe a little bit, but nothing's coming back totally wonky that we can't explain,
Right, and it's not as if your lithic technology suggests that it's not those time periods either, right? So
exactly.
That all seems to fit. I think. Those are lots of reasons to believe that, particularly. I mean, you didn't show the picture of it, but if you have Rama chert or Rama quartzite, I'm not as familiar with the evidence for Rama in that region of Maine, but I know that we only get it here in the Middle Woodland. And I imagine that those connections, it's only in Southern New England. It's only been found in Southern New England during the Middle Woodland period. So, I don't know, you're closer than we are. But that seems Middle Woodlandy to me.
Yeah, me too. I mean, we've got like one piece of it. Every site down east has got like one piece of Rama, So even the later ones, in my experience, yeah.
Well, closer connections than maybe. I don't know. Those don't seem to be. There's not a lot of evidence for those connections continuing in the late Woodland period here.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I should also say that I only know of like one or two sites that have it in all of Connecticut. So
yeah. I mean, it might kind of fit, right? I mean, like Verrazzano comes, rolling up the coast, and he doesn't get a very warm welcome. And part of the reason he maybe doesn't get a very warm welcome is, the indigenous folks in Maine realize a bunch of white people were like kidnapping Beothics and stuff. So that would maybe kind of suggest some of those northern connections. I mean, that's super tenuous, but speculating. There is the northern connections here versus the orientation there, I think really are different.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that there's more of a southerly focus, and that's again, to circle back to what you've been talking about, overarching is probably also related to the horticultural patterns that you see in Southern New England versus maybe Northern New England too, right? So there's this maize connection that you don't necessarily see up there, and that's coming from some farther south. So
yeah, I think that's totally true.
Yeah. If there are other questions, this has been really, really interesting, Gabe.
Thanks. It's a lot of fun.
Appreciate you taking the time to give us this talk. And thanks a lot.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, Gabe. All right.
Cheers.
Bye.